Well, I'm standing here in front of Cup Foods, 38th in Chicago, Minneapolis, Minnesota. This is the site of where George Floyd was killed on May 30th. And we wanted to come here to set the stage for an interview that I'm about to do with a man by the name of Paul Robinson. But it's interesting to me what happened the day after George Floyd was killed. There was a great deal of unity in our country. People seemed to be on the same page as something terrible happened and something terribly wrong. There was something terribly wrong with our country and in our country that needed to be fixed. But then came the protests, which were quickly followed by the riots, which were followed by calls to defund the police. And then it got very political very fast. And that's hard for me to see because I feel like we quickly lost sight of the tragedy of George Floyd and other killings. And we started to get it political. I think what we need to do is to dial back to that day when we were all united and say, what really happened and what does that mean to us? See, the problem that I see happening right now is that black and brown people don't feel safe. It's that simple. They don't feel safe, and it's my responsibility as a white person and as a church to say, if you don't feel safe, I want to hear that. I want to hear about that. Let me just give you a simple example. Let's say I'm an abusive husband, and my wife comes to me and she says, Remy, you know, I don't feel safe with you. You hurt me at times. You know, you're not always bad to me, but there's times when you hurt me, and I don't feel safe with you. What's the proper response on my part? Should I tell her that she's wrong? Should I tell her that it's really her fault? That she doesn't see things clearly? No, I think you understand what I need to do is apologize. I need to listen to her. I need to say what makes you feel unsafe. I need to change my ways. That's the first step, to listen to my wife. And I feel that's what we need to be doing here as a nation right now. Before we form opinions, before we come to conclusions, before we even pass laws and legislations, we need to listen. We need to listen to the voices of the black experience. So that's why we're going to go from here, leave here, and go to the house of Paul Robinson. Join me as we go. Well, welcome. My name is Remy Diederich, and I'm here with Paul Robinson. Paul is the executive minister of Love, Mercy, Do Justice for the Evangelical Covenant Church, and we're at his home here in north of Minneapolis, Minnesota. And Paul, it's great to see you.
It's good to see you too, Remy.
I've known Paul for about the last 8 years. He started a church here in the northern part of Minneapolis, and we had the opportunity to help him out a little bit. But then he just took this new position last year. You were voted in last summer. And what a year. What a year for you to take this position. What's it like to walk into this position and then have all of this hit the fan these last few weeks?
Great. Well, thanks, Remy. First, I want to say how much I appreciate you and your leadership, and want to thank the good folks of Cedarbrook for being a blessing to Grace Outreach when we planted back in 2013. God is faithful, and we just thank God for that journey that Grace Outreach has been on. Yeah, it has been a difficult year. It's been very challenging in lots of ways. The last 3 weeks, I would say month or so, with the knowledge of Ahmaud Arbery's death. I mean, I guess it happened at the beginning of the year, but we learned about it later, and Breonna Taylor, and the video in Central Park, and most recently the death of George Floyd, and then over this past weekend, the death of Rayshard Brooks. It's been challenging. As you can imagine, in Love, Mercy, Do Justice, we're called to join God wherever God is working to make things right in a broken world. There's a lot of brokenness. The good news for us is that Jesus has overcome the world, and so we get to put our hope and trust in Him. And so as a result of our work, our ministry, our calling in Love, Mercy, Do Justice, we've just been very busy responding to opportunities to be on Zoom calls, consult with pastors, give commentary on what's been going on, create statements, put together resources for the church. So while it's been very challenging, it's also been a great opportunity for us because we feel like we've we're called to this season. We feel like God has prepared us for this particular time.
That's great.
And while it's hard, it's what we think we're built to do.
Yeah, well, I wanted to talk to Paul today because, one, I consider him a friend. Obviously, he's a black man. I wanted to get his firsthand experience as a black man during the season, and then also he's an executive minister in our denomination, so he fills a lot of roles here for me today. But Paul, first of all, I want to hear what your personal response is to the death of George Floyd. And I had asked Paul to meet us at 38th and Chicago at a coffee shop right across the street from where George Floyd was killed. And he wrote me back and said, Remy, I'm not ready for that. So that told me that there's something very personal going on inside it. I thought maybe you can just tell us where you're at personally.
Yeah, thanks, Remy. Yeah, there's the part of my life that includes my ministry, my calling,
right,
in the work of love, mercy, and justice. So I'm prepared and called to respond. But then there's Paul the person.
Right.
So Paul the person, in between working or providing ministry support to our denomination, I'm grieving.
Yeah.
George Floyd is me.
Mm-hmm.
George Floyd is my son. George Floyd is my uncle. My father has gone on to be with the Lord, but George Floyd is my father. So George Floyd could be anyone in my family. And so this season has been very strange. It's strange because it's akin to having the people who are grieving at a funeral lead the funeral.
Yeah.
That'd be pastoral malpractice, mm-hmm, right? We would never do that, right? But that's what it feels like sometimes. Mm-hmm. And not just for people who are in ministry like me, but lots of folks of color, family members and friends are kind of inundated with how are you doing, what can we do, how do we respond, but a lot of folks are grieving. And so for me, I've just not worked through enough grief to be able to go to that site without losing it.
Yeah.
And I know that. And so, I got a nice deck. This is a good place to be.
I said, I saw one of your posts right after the death of George Floyd, and you said, you white folk, you might want to wait a few weeks before you ask your black friends how they're doing. Is that right? Am I quoting you right there?
Sorta. Yeah. What I said was, how you're doing in typical times is an entirely appropriate question.
Yeah.
But if you're asking your black friends how they're doing right now, even if they say okay, they're not saying okay.
Right.
Okay is I can't talk about this right now.
Right.
Okay is this is too painful for me. So I was just offering up a more instructive, helpful question would be is how are you taking care of yourself and how can I help?
That's good. Yeah. My daughter and we went to 38th in Chicago the other day, and it was kind of surreal. It was the week after George Floyd had been killed, and I felt a little strange. I was telling Mitch on the way over to your house today that it was kind of like going to someone else's funeral. You want to pay respect to that person and to what happened, but also it was almost like a tourist attraction, and it felt wrong. Because you have a bunch of people, taking the photo ops, and I was there because I wanted to connect the news with the event. I live so close, but also so I felt it was good to be there. I also felt it was bad to be there. I felt like I was trespassing. And I thought when you said that you couldn't go there, I thought, maybe that's one of the reasons you couldn't go there, is just like, what are all these tourists doing here? Taking pictures, selfies in front of the mural. I can see how that could be hard.
Yeah, I'm not sure. It'd be hard to speculate on what others are thinking about. To me, it's almost a sacred site.
Yeah.
but not like going to a church. It's a solemn site, I guess would be a better way to put it, right? It's like, to me, it's akin to, the Holocaust Museum, or where the bombs were dropped in Hiroshima, right? It carries that weight and that gravity where, here's a spot where a man was choked out, his life left his body, and we all was there to bear witness to that, via cell phone video, and it's horrific. And it ought not be a place for tourism. It ought not be a place where people are doing the popular American thing where, we just want to be a part of the movement, and are really kind of not really connecting with the fact that this was a father, he was a son, he was a brother. This is a real human being, and I think if folks can go there with that solemnness, paying respect to the humanity of this person, and also to the loss of the community. A good portion of the community took a hit in the subsequent riots. And so it is a moment for real sobriety and soberness, for folks to reflect and to think about the loss on many different levels, not just his life, but the loss that the community experienced.
Well, it feels a little bit wrong for me to transition, because I want to appreciate where you're at personally. And part of me just wants to let that be, and then say, and then leave, or have coffee together. But I'm also here to hear from, I want to get your perspective as really, I consider an expert in this area. I mean, that's why you're the executive minister for Love, Mercy, Do Justice. So there are some phrases that people use a lot that I think buffer people or keep people away from each other. And I just want to run them by you and get your feedback. And the most obvious one is Black Lives Matter. For some people, that's a buzzword that they don't like. For others, it's an anthem. So I like that phrase, because I think you need to give attention to an area that hasn't been given attention. But what would you say about that phrase, Black Lives Matter?
Yeah, I would say true. Absolutely. I'd say amen if I were in a church. I think the reason why some struggle with the phrase Black Lives Matter, and now my comments, I'm detaching from the organization called Black Lives Matter. I'm just talking about that phrase. We have this notion in America of something called a meritocracy, which essentially means you can be anything you want in America if you work hard enough. All right, so we have this belief. It's a part of our narrative as Americans. But the notion of meritocracy is really a myth. More than anything else, your zip code determines your success in America. Nobody worked harder than my parents. But because of their education, because of the community that they lived in, their success was capped. Now, there are people who defy the odds, and are able to escape the trappings of their zip code, right? But that doesn't happen for the masses. So with this idea of America being a meritocracy, some folks, majority white folks, hear the term Black Lives Matter, and they hear exceptionalism. They hear, wait a minute, we should all be treated the same, and why are you picking one group over another group? The problem with that is that they assume that everybody's being treated the same. They are operating on this notion of a meritocracy, that everything, that the playing field is actually level. But it's not. And
that's why one of the other phrases I had for you was all lives matter. So maybe you're kind of hitting on that now. So they would say, no, wait a minute, all lives matter. And why is that? I think that phrase is sometimes offensive. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but tell me if that's true or not.
I think it's offensive when it's used as a counter to Black Lives Matter.
Okay.
Folks who say or use Black Lives Matter as a slogan, they also accept that all lives matter.
Sure.
And as people of faith, as those who follow Jesus, for God, all lives do matter. But all lives don't matter in America.
Right.
That's why you have to say Black Lives Matter.
Right.
All lives don't matter in terms of how people experience life, in terms of their outcomes as it relates to health, in terms of their interactions with the judicial system, in terms of education opportunities. So when folks say Black Lives Matter, they're saying, hey, wait a minute. We want you to know that we're not experiencing life the way the majority folks are experiencing life. So that those two phrases go together. They're counter to each other. Black Lives Matter is a protest statement. It's saying, see me, I exist, my family exists, my community exists, and we're not having the same experience that the rest of you are having. I think the other thing that's important to note with this is that we still find ourselves in parallel but separate experiences in America. There's the experience that white folks are having, and I would say poor white folks are having a more similar experience to people of color than middle class and upper class. And these are parallel experiences, but they're separate. So I believe most folks are good people and well-meaning, but we're walled off from our history. In fact, we're walled off from the experiences of other people, right? Jesus says, I got to go to Samaria, right? In other words, I've got to experience, I've got to be in relationship, I got to be in community with people who are different than me, and people who I've been taught to hate and distrust. I've got to have a connection with. And so as believers, we have to start asking our questions. Who are the Samaritans we know? If we don't have any relationships with Samaritans, we're not doing what Jesus asked us to do, which is to be in intentional cross-cultural relationships. And America, in a general sense, is walled off from its history.
I was reading a book called Wide Awake.
Oh yeah.
And
Daniel.
He said something in there that really caught me. He said he was in a class, and they asked people in the class to write down the 3 people who influenced them the most spiritually. And so that was pretty easy. He wrote down the 3 people, and then he asked everyone in the room, how many of those people are of a different color than you? And he said, well, I guess all 3 people were white. And then the professor said, so how do you think that influences your theology? I mean, if all your inputs into your decision making come from one stream of thought, how can you really grasp the full spectrum of who God is? And I just thought, wow, I had never thought about that before. Like I can say that Black Lives Matter, but I'm not listening to the voices of black people or brown people or whomever. I'm not getting the full spectrum of how God might think on a topic.
That's good, Remy.
So along the same line, I think people, I'm trying to bring to the surface some things that I've heard from other people, especially Christians. Another thing that I've heard recently is people are afraid that somehow whenever we talk about justice in the church, or especially social justice, racial justice, people get nervous, like the culture is we're going to compromise. We're going to get sucked in to a cultural way of looking at things rather than a biblical way, which I think is a concern. But my concern with that thinking is that we're always holding justice or social justice at a distance because we're afraid of compromising. Do you want to comment on that?
Sure, I could say a little bit about that. I think part of that critique, I would respectfully say, comes out of bad theology.
Okay.
It's the best way to put it.
Okay.
You can't read the Bible, Old or New Testament, and not see culture. Jews are cultural people. Yeah. Jesus was a cultural being. The folks that got cleared out of the promised land, they all had culture, right? So culture is a part of the human existence. Now, race is made up.
Yeah.
Race is a sociological construct. It doesn't exist. There's no biological or scientific basis for race. But all human beings have culture and ethnicity. So, yeah, it does involve culture, right? And if we look at the life of Jesus expressly, we see Jesus being very much engaged with the culture of his time. He got criticized too. He said, how can you eat with these publicans and sinners? They had a different culture.
Yeah.
They had a different way of life. But Jesus, right, was trying to win them over to the good news of God's grace and love. And so I don't know how we can really understand each other if we don't attend to the things of culture. Culture is a part of the human existence. And if you detach Jesus from being a Middle Eastern man that came from a particular ethnic and cultural group, you're not understanding the scriptures. You're not understanding really what's going on. What we've done, particularly in America, is that we've taken the gospel and we've put a Western capitalistic template over it. And now the template informs the gospel instead of the gospel informing the template. And so this is why we can detach ourselves and say, well, we don't want to get into culture, or we don't want to get into politics, right? Because that gets us away from the Bible. Well, that's really convenient when you're in the majority. And you set the tone for the culture. You determine, how policing works, how politics works, how economics works, how education works, how the justice system works.
You see that?
Right?
Yeah.
So that's kind of convenient, right? Right? But I don't get to say when I walk out of my house, I'm not going to be a cultural being today. That gets determined the moment I walk out of my house.
Yeah.
By my optics.
Sure.
There's a narrative that's attached to me that I didn't have anything to do with. People don't know that, I'm an upstanding citizen. I love my wife. I love my children. I graduated from high school, went on, got a college degree, went on and got a master's of divinity. They don't know that. They see a black guy. A black guy that I've been taught to be afraid of. He's a threat.
Yeah.
Or he's up to no good. Just because of my packaging.
Right.
So how do I not deal with culture?
Yeah.
How do I not attend to that? Right?
Sure.
That's just my reality. I have to be aware of those things.
Yeah, that's good. All right, another one last phrase I've got for Paul here, and that is when people often defend themselves. I think we often, as white people, we get defensive when we're considered that we might be considered a racist.
Sure.
And so we'll say, I don't see color, Paul. I don't see color.
Yeah.
How does that affect you? What does that say to you if I tell you I don't see color?
Yeah, I think I know what people are saying when they say that. I think what they're trying to say is your race or ethnicity isn't making a difference in our relationship.
Right.
I think that's what they're trying to say.
That's the good interpretation.
I think that's what folks are trying to say. But when you say you don't see color, to me, it denies my existence.
Right. I don't see you.
I don't see. Remy, I can't tell you how many times I've been in some grocery store or waiting in a pharmacy, and I'm next in line. Now, we're sitting right now, but I'm like 6'1", almost 6'2", dark-skinned black guy. And the white woman behind me gets asked, can I help you? But I'm next. Now, how could you miss me? Because I don't see color. I've been taught to, avoid, ignore, not attend to. And we tend to gravitate toward the things that we're most comfortable with. So when you say you don't see color, I'll take the most, gracious and affirmative interpretation of that, meaning that I think what you're trying to say is my color doesn't make a difference in our relationship. But I would ask those same people if they'd be willing to trade their life for the life of a a typical, whatever that is, or average African American in America. If all lives matter, let's switch.
That's good.
Let's switch.
Yeah.
Right? If we're all treated the same, let's swap out and see what it's like. You were so gracious a few years ago, and you invited a bunch of us pastors up to one of the cabins that you have, or somebody in your church.
Right.
And I needed time off, and that was a really wonderful invitation, and so I took it. But the whole time up that I was driving, I was terrified. It's 2 hours from my house. I'm on rural roads, doing sections of that road. The GPS goes out, so it's not talking anymore, right? And so I'm terrified. Why am I terrified? I'm terrified because I don't know if Bubba's gonna be on this road having a bad day. I don't know if some neighbor's gonna say, hey, I just saw a black guy go down County Road X, and I don't think he's from around here. I don't know if some, right? So I'm fearful, right? That's an experience that, you know, I wanted to have, but at the same time, getting there was very frightening. Why? Because I'm having a different experience with the sheriff.
Right.
I'm having a different experience with law enforcement. I'm having different experience with folks who are in rural contexts, who aren't accustomed to seeing folks like me. I'm not from around there, so I could be considered a threat or something to be subdued. People can assume the wrong thing, and then I don't make it home to my wife. So those are real fears. You know, one of the questions that you put was that, you know, folks, you know, have a problem because people are afraid. Well, that fear is actually real. It's not made up. People are afraid. They do have real fears about themselves, their family members, and their existence in this society. And it's not overstating it.
Right.
And the reason why it lands so odd to folks in the majority, or white folks, is because that's not their experience. And if it's not their experience, they assume that it doesn't exist.
Yeah, you know, the thing that really, I've quoted this woman numerous times since, but about 2 or 3 years ago, a black woman in our church, and she said, Remy, I'm afraid that her black son is going to grow up and get shot. And I don't know why, but that just hit me like a 2x4 across the head, because I thought, I've never worried about my 3 kids growing up and getting shot. And then she just kind of went on to illustrate some of the things that you just shared, some of the different experiences that she lives with every day that I would never even cross my mind.
Right.
So when the idea that I don't see color, I thought, no, I want to see color. I want to factor in what your experience is. So when we walk down a street, realizing that your experience of walking down a street is different than my walking down that street, just by the nature of our color.
Yeah, and also we want to affirm what God affirms. God made me this way. So if you say you don't see me, what are you saying to God?
Right.
I see you. You don't see color, you know, it's not going to make a difference. And the truth is, it's borne out by the research, it does make a difference.
Sure.
It makes a difference in terms of how people are treated, you know, their outcomes as it relates to getting the loans, where they get a chance to live, all sorts of different things, or metrics in our particular society. So, you know, it really does matter. But I do think people should work hard to not have it matter. That's something that we can do personally, right? And the only way you can really do that is, you know, something that you've done, is to build intentional cross-cultural relationships with people who are different than you. That's the way you grow. That's the way you expand. That's the way you see the breadth and depth of God's kingdom. That's the way you learn. That's the way you grow. That's the way you're stretched. And that's also the way that you can be more effective in evangelism and discipleship. Yeah,
and that was my next question, you know, trying to bring this home. You know, I was thinking about, so I grew up in western Bloomington, south of here, about an hour or so. And that was, at the time, was very white. And then I moved to western rural Wisconsin, very white. And so, to no fault of my own or the people who live around me, we just haven't grown up around people of color. And so, one of the reasons I want to have this interview is just to help us back home to go, I know you're not confronted with these thoughts on a regular basis, so I want to kind of force us to think this through a little bit. So speak to us speak to me. I'm a here learner first today. But speak to me. Speak to people that I live with in rural Wisconsin who don't see a lot of people of color in their daily life. What can we be doing as a church specifically to help bring us up to speed in this area? So we're bringing the kingdom of God to Menomonie, Wisconsin. If not, we don't have experiences with individual people very much, but just in the way we think and the way we talk.
Sure, that's a great question. So I often say that the first step toward being more culturally competent is actually not a step out, it's a step in.
Okay.
And what I mean by that is it is important to build meaningful cross-cultural relationships with other people. And that can be, you can begin that process through plenty of books and resources. You mentioned one. There's actually a pretty significant suite of resources around, biblical justice, cross-cultural relationships, race, racism, those kinds of things. And so I would say folks should definitely partake in those things. But I think the first step, though, is a step in. Who am I? Where do I come from? What's my story? Who are my people, right?
Sure.
Because in America, right, we have this other template of this sociological construct called race, right? And so race forces us or invites us through our shaping from little kids to adopt these categories: white, black, Asian, right? All these different categories. And in those categories are templates and paradigms and ways of being, right? And so part of what white folks need to be doing as a first step, taking a step in, is deconstructing whiteness.
What does that mean?
That means to shed off, right, the weight of this sociological construct of this is what it means to play your role. So what's your heritage?
German.
Okay. Right?
Yeah.
So America says, Remy, forget about that German stuff. We want you to be white. But when your ancestors came here, they were German.
Yeah.
Make no mistake about it. And they experienced quite a bit of racism and oppression, right? But after a few generations, the German thing kind of falls to the side, and now you're just white, right? But what the step toward cultural competence is to get back in touch with what it means to be German. What are those stories that your grandma and your great-grandma told? What are the foods that the folks in your family used to talk about? Why did you do the things that you used to do? Because all of those things were shaping and forming, and those things helped build the culture that you came out of, that your family helped shape and form. So when folks say, well, I don't want to talk about culture, what else would you talk about? We all come from culture.
Right.
Now, our parents aren't sitting us down and saying, we're having a culture lesson, son. No, they just do what they do. And we interpret it. Actually, one definition of culture is the right way to do something. We learn that this is the right way to do something. Well, America says, we don't want you to really pay attention to those parts. We want you to pay attention to the narrative of what it means to be white, because that's the category you've been put in by the level of melanin that's in your skin, right? And America wants me to pay attention to what it means to be black, right? That there's a certain way I'm supposed to act and behave and dress and so forth and so on. And these codes were a lot more prevalent in years before, right? And so we have to throw that off. It's a cloak, if you will, that keeps us from getting in touch with our true ethnicity and heritage. And once we can understand that whiteness is not the same as who we are as cultural beings, right? Then we can begin that journey of building an authentic cross-cultural relationship with somebody else. So for example, once you understand that, oh, well, I played these games when I was a kid, and we told these nursery rhymes, we said these kind of riddles. So then you can have a conversation with me and say, okay, what were the games you played? Mm-hmm. What were the songs you sang? What were the type of, now we have places where we can communicate and we can build a relationship because we both understand we're cultural beings. Mm-hmm. That is to me the starting place, understanding that you're a cultural being, right? So then
we have those things in common.
We have those things in common.
Yeah, and it's
right. So it's like
you're not foreign.
I'm not foreign.
Right.
I've gotten that right here in Blaine. Where are you from? Like, what do you mean?
Like what country?
Yeah, like what do you mean? I live on Jenkins.
Right.
I mean, I used to live in Chicago. You could probably tell my accent, maybe be a little different, but no, we're not foreign. We all basically want the same things. Mm-hmm. But if we live our lives cloaked in the mantle of whiteness or blackness or whatever that is, then we miss out on who we really are. I don't want to play some role that a sociological construct laid out for me. Mm-hmm. I want to be who God has made me to be. Mm-hmm. In all of its beauty, right? I want to live that out. And if I can fully understand who I am and understand all the complexity of me, then I'm in a position that I can understand the complexity of somebody else. I won't say, oh, that's just a white guy. No. Yeah. He's more than that, much more than that. Yeah. He's got a story. He comes from a people. Mm-hmm. There's food there. There's tragedy. There's loss. There's triumph. There's interest, because that's what's in me. Yeah. And if we reduce people to a caricature, right? If we flatten people to say that's just a white guy, or that's just an Asian guy, or that's just a black guy. Mm-hmm. We're erasing their humanity, and that's not what God does to us.
Yeah, I heard once, and I've always appreciated this quote, that once you label someone, you can disregard them.
Yes.
So if I just reduce you to a black man, or mm-hmm. whatever it is I label you as,
and whatever narrative that's been attached to black men. Yeah, that's the biggest thing.
So maybe I should not even use that. If I label you as a, let's say, an alcoholic, well, he's just an alcoholic. Right. I don't have to respect an alcoholic. He's a control freak. Yeah. I don't have to respect a control freak. So I separate your humanity by the mere labeling of you with one word. Yes. And we can do that with your blackness too.
Yeah. Or your race, ethnicity, culture, all of it, for sure. Yeah.
Well, Paul, this has been great. I appreciate hearing from you. Is there anything, we could probably go on for a bit? Yeah. And I noticed as we talked that we got closer and closer and more animated, so I like that. That's a good sign. But is there anything that you'd like to add that maybe we didn't touch on that you'd really like to get across? So you can just speak right to the camera. What do you want us to know? Anything?
Gosh. I think I would want the listeners at Cedarbrook and beyond to know that God has called us to be in this together. It doesn't matter that you might live in a community where there's 1 or 2% people of color. If we're going to get out of this mess that we find ourselves in, we're going to have to do it together. It's not the responsibility of just people of color to fight for justice. It's everybody's responsibility. God is a God that loves justice. Justice shows up like 400 times in the Old Testament, right? And so if God is committed to justice, we should be committed to justice. And if we're committed to justice, we're on the side of God, and that's where I want everybody to be, and that's what we should be working for. And if we commit to doing that, just making the corner brighter where we are, right, together, we'll be able to make a difference in our communities.
I'll say amen to that.
Amen to that.
Thanks a lot, Paul. We're not going to shake hands because we're in the middle of a pandemic.
We're doing the Wakanda.
We're doing this.